Well, I'd like to welcome everyone. Let's start the broadcast in a couple of minutes. So just stay with us until a few more people join. So just bear with us another minute or two. Thank you. Okay, so we will start with now, and I'm sure more people will join as we proceed. So it is my pleasure and an honor to welcome everyone to this webinar on how to deal with the stress and anxiety during the COVID-19 pandemic. This coronavirus has impacted all of us in many different ways, and our lives have had to deal with new challenges, and as a result, has brought upon us much stress and anxiety. And before I dwell on more on this webinar, let me tell you a bit about OFIC, Overseas Friends of Canada, is a volunteer, not-for-profit Canadian organization. All of its executives are volunteers and they do not receive any remuneration. 100% of any funds received are spent on its activities and events it organizes, such as this one. OFIC brings together Canadians, Indo-Canadians, as well as people from other communities of all ages, all religions, all ethnicities, all faiths, and political stripes, following the spirit of multiculturalism. Friendship and our core civilization values to work towards strengthening the ties between India and Canada and serving the Canadians at large. OFIC's mission is to foster friendly and mutual, respectful relationship between the people, citizens of Canada and India, to enrich, project, and promote this positive image of the Republic of India in Canada and vice versa of Canada. OFIC has done many webinars and events such as webinar on health awareness, has done fundraising for victims of fire of Fort McMurray of Alberta, and one of our main events we do every year is the National Diwali celebration on the Parliament Hill. And this year it was a virtual one, and it was held on November the 12th. We were lucky to have Aaron O'Toole, the leader of opposition, as our chief guest, as he gave his greetings to all Canadians and especially to the Hindu Canadians. The executives of the OFIC are made up of myself as the president, Shiv Bhaskar, Dr. Narinder Garg as executive vice president, Shefali Adhikari as program director, Kulbhushan Kapoor as a treasurer, and Nagmani Sharma as secretary, and Puneet Agarwal, who is our technical director. This webinar is hosted with the help of Evet Solutions, who are providing the project management and the IT solutions. Canadians of Indian origin have always played a constructive role in the development of the world and Canada, and we will continue to do so. When we get up in the morning every day, our mission is how can we make everyone's day better? So recently we did a food drive for Ottawa Food Bank. To tell you more about this, I'll turn it over to our program. Foley, go ahead. You can
Okay.
talk about the event.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Mental Health Awareness and COVID-19. I'm Shefali Adhikari, the Director of Programs, Art and Culture for OFIC. As Shiv mentioned, OFIC team has been involved in providing community services voluntarily in providing and promoting mental health awareness programs and also raising funds, for instance, for Fort McMurray victims of fire. In the wake of coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, it has been a tough year for all of us. And however, in this traditional season of giving love, peace and joy, OFIC emerged to commit in providing continuing services to the community and vulnerable people across the city. So on 13th of December, Team OFIC got together and collectively made food donations of non-perishable items to the Ottawa Food Bank. By giving food to the needy, we give them warmth and hope to live. We also appreciate all the volunteers around in Canada for their incredible services with a message to keep up the amazing work that all the food banks are doing across our great country of Canada. As a team, we encourage viewers and listeners today to donate to a charity of your choice. These gifts of hope really help those in need, and it is a great way to bring a smile on their faces. Thank you very much once again, and welcome to all of those who have just joined us on this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for being here and providing us with a lot of tips and great presentation. We are looking forward. Over to you, Shiv.
Yeah, thank you, Shefali. Thank you for nice words. Uh, okay, now let us start with our main program. We will have a presentation for 1 hour by Dr. Owen P. Then we will have a question and answer period for 30 minutes or longer if needed. Now, a bit about Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a clinical psychologist and executive director of innovation at the Ottawa Institute of Cognitive Behaviour Therapy in Ottawa, Canada. He provides individual and group treatments to adults for mood and anxiety disorder and is actively involved in developing innovative clinical programming to increase the accessibility and effectiveness of psychological therapies. He is a clinical professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa and adjunct research professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Carleton University. In addition to publishing scientific papers, Dr. Kelly is co-author of the Clinical Manual, Treating Psychosis, a guide to mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion-based approaches with the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition. He's also co-author of the Canadian adaptation of the textbook, Research Method in Psychology for Oxford University Press. Dr. Kelly gives talks to organizations on a variety of topics within the field of psychology, mental illness, stress, coping, and wellness. Finally, he hosts and produces the Ottawa Institute of Cognitive Behavior Therapy podcast, Thoughts on Record. Now help me welcome Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a delight to speak to any group. I spend most of my week in my office helping people sort of in a one-on-one capacity. So to have the opportunity to speak to a larger group is always very welcome and a chance to get a lot of information out to a lot of people all at the same time. So again, thank you so much for the invite today, and what a wonderful initiative you folks have initiated. You might have seen in one of the welcome screens when you logged in, there is free, confidential, individual one-on-one counseling available through OFIC and funding that they have procured. So basically, you just email the address here to schedule a session. They will put you in touch directly with a service provider. And I'll have this slide show up a couple more times within the session in case you've missed it, but this is a wonderful opportunity for those who may not be able to normally access psychological services owing to the prohibitive costs, to be able to access this help through this program. So again, I think this is just such a wonderful initiative. Okay, so the key themes for today. So what I'd like to do is, I guess there's a couple different things I want to accomplish, but overall, I want to help you build an understanding of mental health within the context of COVID-19. And so I'll talk specifically about the challenges of dealing with mental health within the COVID-19 pandemic, but then also I want to give you some general information as well around mental health and mental illness that I think you can carry with you well beyond this particular situation. So I want to start by talking about why I think COVID-19 pandemic is such a potent stressor for all of us. I think about myself as a psychologist who should have all of the coping strategies available to them. It's been a very difficult time, above and beyond just being a human being. I want to talk about a brief consideration of what stress is and how it impacts the body and mind. That's really important, understanding why the COVID-19 pandemic is having the impact that it is. I want to talk about recognizing the signs of depression and anxiety in yourself and loved ones or friends. That's really important. Sometimes we can just go along on autopilot and not be aware of how dramatically we may be affected of things, and having it pointed out can often build awareness. And when you have awareness, then you can take the steps that you need to take care of yourself. I want to talk about how you can enhance meaning, motivation, and resiliency through effective self-care strategies that are informed by cognitive behavioral principles, which can be really quite helpful. Again, it's a bit of a challenge during COVID-19, but I want to talk about how I think we can go about these things during this context. And then I also want to talk about how to renegotiate your relationship with difficult emotions, situations, or circumstances rather than avoid them. And the importance of that will become clear as I move throughout the presentation. Okay, so if we think about the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, I want to talk about why it's so stressful at this particular moment. The first thing that I want to point out, and I'll elaborate this on a couple slides, is that this pandemic has all of the necessary, I'm air quoting here, active ingredients present for a very potent stressor, in that it's chronic, unpredictable, and uncontrollable with respect to its nature, right? And for the mammalian nervous system, we don't like those things. We like things to be short-lived, predictable, and controllable. The COVID-19 pandemic is not any of those things, so it presents a real challenge to us. I think that anxiety and depression is certainly both problematic now. I'm seeing this a lot in my clinical load week over week. And not only is it a problem now, I think it's likely to be a problem well into the future. First of all, we're all faced with what I'm calling a structural depression via social distancing. We are being cut off artificially from a lot of the things that would normally be mood boosters or distractions or stress relievers. And we are cut off from people, most importantly. And what we see is that, a lot of the things that are being forced upon us now in order to keep the virus spread at bay are very much the same kind of factors and forces that we would see in the life of someone who's depressed. So there's this structural depression that's been imposed upon us. There's a lot of loss at the moment, right? Whether it be financial, if you're a small business owner, it could be health related, certainly people who are directly affected by COVID-19 or who have, ongoing chronic conditions for which their regular healthcare is being disrupted. There's the social impact as well, which I had mentioned previously. These are all coming together to create a significant loss experience for all of us. Even when the measures are lifted, and of course there's a vaccine in sight, but it's probably going to be a good 6 to 8 months before we see anything resembling back to normal, and probably even that's optimistic. Many of us are going to struggle with the pressure of returning to previous expectations while we are still catching our breath and getting our legs under us from this, what will end up being sort of like a year or year and a half of really, really challenging conditions. And I can tell you what I see clinically when I meet with people is that most people can run on adrenaline pretty well for the first while, say during unemployment or the breakup of a relationship or the illness of a child. It's when the stressor is passed that oftentimes the body will relax, and then you see significant problems happen because you don't have the adrenaline pushing the person through anymore. They'll be of a letdown. So I think things are going to get worse before they get better, even though there's better news in sight. There's the impact of the repeated waves of COVID-19 and the public health measures required. We're going through a second wave right now. We could probably anticipate there might even be another wave, heading into the spring or the summer. For some of us, there's going to be a lot of difficulty undoing current public health recommendations. So, what was an obsessive compulsive disorder compulsion around washing hands 10 months ago is now a public health recommendation. So How many of us are going to struggle to stop wearing the mask even when we're given the all clear, or using alcohol wipes all the time, or washing our hands, or staying away from people? It's going to be difficult for us to undo all of these measures. And then, of course, for those in the audience who know or are themselves healthcare workers, or have folks in their family or within their circle that work within a long-term care facility or similar, the difficulty and the burnout that particular group is experiencing at the moment. So you put this all together, and wow, just what a difficult situation that we find ourselves in at this particular moment. It's not surprising that we are all struggling to varying degrees, just given what we are faced with at the moment. Okay, so one of the why are we so stressed out? It's important to realize that human beings are built on a hunter-gatherer platform, right? We are sort of nomadic, tribal people, lived in very small groups, and we were this way for a very long time. And most of our physiology is exquisitely adapted towards dealing with these acute life or death stressors, like attacked by a predator, attacked by another human. Technology in the world have changed so quickly that we've taken hunter-gatherer software and plopped it right into the middle of this modern world for which we are not really that well adapted. So we've got problems to do with money, time crunches. So, we're not dealing with life or death stressors so much anymore, because that's what we're quite used to dealing with. It's chronic, low-grade stress that is happening all the time, that's chronic in nature. And again, our bodies just really aren't built for it. So even before COVID-19, a lot of people were having trouble keeping up with the demands of what society asks of us on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I think what COVID has done in many ways is exerted just a little bit more pressure, and it's broken a lot of systems where we were just simply getting away with things that we shouldn't have been getting away with for a long time. What I'm hoping for some people is that they'll look at changes they've made during the pandemic and carry some of those through when we get back to quote-unquote normal life, because a lot of what we were doing before was unsustainable. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you look at human beings, some of the things, what goes into making something stressful is when it is chronic, when it's unpredictable, when it's uncontrollable, and when it's ambiguous. The more these things are chronic, the more that they're unpredictable, the more that they're uncontrollable, the more ambiguous they are, like what's going to happen, the more stressful the event will be. We really like things to be short-lived, predictable, controllable, and have a lot of certainty. That is not what is going on at this particular moment. So, COVID sort of tailor-made to create the experience of stress in us. Okay, so it's important to understand how stress impacts us from a biological perspective. So there's this, if you look over on the left-hand side of the screen, there's this axis called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And don't even worry about that too specifically. It's just the idea is that when we're stressed out, this HPA axis facilitates the release of a neurochemical called cortisol. Cortisol is a major stress hormone in the body. If you did not have it, you'd actually die. There are disorders where you can have too little cortisol, which is called Addison's. And then you can also have Cushing syndrome, where you have too much cortisol in the body. So cortisol is a very tightly regulated stress hormone that serves a number of important functions in the brain. So cortisol will help to modulate things like attention, memory, concentration. It prepares the cardiovascular system for upregulating or downregulating itself. It's responsible for a number of metabolic changes. It's what's called a catabolic hormone, meaning that it breaks down stores of fat in the body so that we can have lots of energy to prepare us for dealing with stressors. And it also has an anti-inflammatory action. So when we're stressed out, the body anticipates that maybe a bad thing's going to happen to us, like an injury of some kind. It preventively releases cortisol. Cortisol is in circulation to try and reduce the amount of inflammation that might happen at the site of an injury. These are just amazing, amazing mechanisms for regulating ourselves in the face of stressors. And again, I can't emphasize enough, our system has been engineered to deal with stressors that are short-lived, life or death, right? It's not designed to go on forever and ever and ever and ever, all right? So chronic stress has a lot of problems associated with it. So for example, when stress goes on for too long and our cortisol system is firing for too long and adrenaline is going on for too long, cortisol can impair metabolism within the brain, and then you start to get the evolution of mental illness, symptoms like depression, anxiety, which we'll talk about momentarily. You can get the evolution of cardiovascular disease. And I should stress, this is not something that happens over the course of, days or weeks or months even. This is over the course of years. Let's say someone's in a very stressful job, say maybe in finance or business where there's a lot of uncertainty, a small business owner, it's that cardiovascular damage builds up over time. Cortisol also disrupts, cortisol being too high for too long can disrupt our metabolic processes such that we're more vulnerable to things like type 2 diabetes, which is essentially a metabolic disease. And of course, you can get immune disturbances. You may have noticed that during times of stress, if you can remember being in school or you are in school around exams, you might have noticed that you're more prone to getting colds this time of year, or maybe during your spring exams, because your cortisol level is high, suppresses the immune system and that anti-inflammatory action. But as a result, if that goes on for too long, it leaves you vulnerable to things like colds, infections, things like that, right? Which of course has an important implication at a time like this when we have COVID circulating in the community. So again, I just want to speak a little bit more to the biology of how stress impacts us. So normally the body's, it's always striving to maintain what we call homeostasis, right? Which is a sense of balance. And so what happens when the demands are relatively, let's say, normal or under baseline conditions, this is a little picture, I should just back up. This is a little picture of the end of a neuron, right? And neurons will release neurotransmitters. And what happens is that, under normal conditions, the body can no problem make as much neurotransmitter as required. It's just sort of constantly doing this. As stressors get a little bit more acute, say the pressure starts to go up, you're having to work more hours, your body can compensate, right? It can say, oh, hey, we need more serotonin, we need more dopamine, we need more norepinephrine. It will start to spit out more of these chemicals. And it can do that for a while. It can do that for a few days, for a few weeks, maybe even a few months if you're lucky. However, what happens is if that stress starts to pile up and goes on for months and months and months, the brain gets tired and it's unable to continue to output neurochemicals at the same level that it was previously. It would be like, if you needed extra money and you took on extra shifts at your part-time job, you could do that for a little bit, right? You could work 40, 50 hours a week. Try working 60 hours a week for more than, a couple months. The body will start to collapse, right? It will start to take you out in an effort to slow you down. So this is what happens. So our body's exquisitely adapted to dealing with short-term stressors, but as the stress goes on, it depletes our resources. We're not able to keep up with the demands required, and then over time, we get a net reduction in the ability to cope. And then this is when you start to get things like depression, anxiety, burnout, exhaustion, things like this. And it's, I think, safe to say for many of us now that we're, 9-10 months into the pandemic, a lot of us are finding that we have sort of hit our limit. And with looming lockdowns coming and the intensification of the second wave, many of us are going to find that our ability to cope is probably about maxed out, and it would be difficult to continue on at this level. But again, there's good news. I'll talk about what we can do to buffer the impacts that the situation is having. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you folks today about depression and anxiety because those are going to be the two most common manifestations from a mental health perspective during a time like this. So depression as defined clinically is when we experience for at least 2 weeks, nearly every day the following: depressed mood, our reduced interest in pleasurable activities. I should add that sometimes we don't have both of those at the same time. What we often find is that, and these are generalizations, but women will report being sad more of the time versus men may have more of a reduced interest or maybe more irritable and angry. Okay. Also a disturbed appetite, it can go either way. So some people will find themselves eating more, some people will find themselves eating less. Same with sleep. Some people will find themselves oversleeping. Some people will find that they're having insomnia, either trouble getting to sleep or what we call maintenance insomnia, where they can't stay asleep. They're waking up like 3, 4 in the morning and really can't get back to sleep. Despite being exhausted, we call this being wired and tired. There can be often a sense of worthlessness or guilt. People talk about having cognitive difficulties where there's an inability to concentrate or difficulty making decisions. Sometimes we can even get what we call suicidal ideation, where people become overwhelmed and they start to have thoughts of, of death, or that they'd be better off dead, or that people would be better off without them being around. Now, that I should add, that doesn't happen exclusively within the context of depression. Happens within other illnesses as well, but it does go along with depression as one of the symptoms. Suicide is something I do want to spend a few moments on. It's important to talk about it. I think, we're afraid to talk about suicide because, there's a myth out there that talking about it will make it somehow more likely that it will happen, or might put an idea in somebody's head. There's absolutely no evidence that that's the case. And in fact, it's more dangerous to not talk about suicide. So whenever I can meet with a group of people, I always do like to talk about it, just because it is something that we are afraid to talk about. So what are some of the warning signs and risk factors for suicide? Well, a family history of suicide is important. Recent drug and alcohol use. Almost 80 to 90% of people who complete suicide have substances in their system at the time of death. A previous suicide attempt is something we would assess. Depressed mood, hopelessness, insomnia. Often people who end up harming themselves will be awake for 2 or 3 days and have a lot of agitation prior to. A decline in work or school performance, withdrawing from friends and family, speaking about suicide in either vague or concrete terms, a sudden or unexplained improvement in mood, which is a bit surprising, but sometimes people feel a release from perhaps what they're considering doing, diagnosis of a serious illness or death of a loved one, a financial calamity, breakup of a relationship, an intense accumulation of some kind. All of these, if you put them all together, no one of these is really a great predictor, but if you look at them in aggregate as a group, then it starts to put a picture together of someone's risk factor. And I can't emphasize this enough. Even for experienced clinicians like myself, suicide can be very hard to predict. Talking about suicide does not increase the risk of someone taking their own life, right? If you're concerned, ask somebody about it. They'll be relieved, they'll be thankful that you cared enough to check in with them to see what was going on. This is very important. Okay, also anxiety. So anxiety is another thing that we expect people to experience. And so anxiety we talk about as being, now this is criteria for what we call generalized anxiety disorder, which, but it will give you a sense of, what we call anxiety just in sort of normal, everyday garden variety version. So where there's uncontrollable worry about work, a relationship, COVID, your health, what's going to happen, difficulty concentrating. People who are anxious will often report that their memory is poor. They forget where they parked their car. They'll walk into a room and forget why they're in that room in the first place. You're not going crazy, quote unquote, right? This is what anxiety does. Sometimes there can be a little bit of an extra layer of anxiety or irritability or anger. It's not uncommon to talk about having muscle tension, like in the neck or the back. Those are common places, sometimes in the jaw as well. Feeling easily fatigued, like we don't have a lot of energy, and sleep disturbances of all kinds. And there are many kinds of anxiety disorders, like panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, PTSD, health anxiety, etc. It's outside of the scope of the talk today, but I just wanted to let you know that there are these other forms of anxiety that are out there. There's a very special and defined relationship between depression and anxiety. Depression usually follows a period of increased anxiety, or another way of saying that is depression is usually preceded by increased anxiety. So a very common pattern that we see is that someone will have been very anxious for maybe 4 to 6 months, and then their mood will start to decline. And again, I think a lot of people were pretty anxious at the start of COVID. Now, some people may be entering into a phase of more increased depression as this chronic stressor goes on. Anxiety may increase stress levels and or veer the individual away from healthy forms of coping. So, there's this sort of feedback loop where as people get more anxious, they may start to consume alcohol with greater frequency. They may stop going to the gym. They may eat more unhealthy foods. They may stay away from other people, all of which starts to accelerate the cycle of decompensation. right? It might be one of the first signs that is noticed. And for people who know their pattern, it can often be considered a warning sign. So some people know that, hey, when my anxiety's up, I've got to take steps to address this sooner than later, because if it goes on for a long period of time, it's the kind of thing that could end up leading to me feeling depressed. Getting out in front of anxiety is often a very effective strategy for preventing depression happening in the first place. And as we move through the talk, I'll be showing you folks some strategies for dealing with this, so that we can get out in front of the depression before it happens. Okay, when should I seek treatment? You know, that's a question that I get a lot in my personal life from people who know I'm a psychologist. For a whole bunch of reasons. The earlier, the better. And we'll talk about this when I show you some of the models. But the idea is that there's a function called what we call sensitization in the brain, where once you've had one episode of depression, it makes it more likely that you'll experience subsequent episodes of depression for reasons that are, you know, well outside of a talk like this, but you just know that that's the case. So the best predictor of a depressive episode down the road is having a previous episode of depression. And one of the ways this works, and again, I'll show you a model of this that, you know, I think is pretty interesting, is that you know, when we are depressed, it creates circumstances in our life that create more stress, that creates more depression. It starts to cycle on itself. Generally speaking, you know, when symptoms are starting to impact on daily functioning, your ability to work effectively, relationships, impact your quality of life, that's a clue that you should check in with somebody, right? That's a clue that you should reach out for help where and when it's available, and start to unpack what's going on for yourself. Certainly, if there's any concern about safety, right? If someone feels that they've been, you know, feeling life isn't worth living anymore, or having thoughts of harming themselves, or, you know, not really, you know, oh, if I got COVID or if I got a serious disease, I wouldn't care. That's an indication that it might be time to check in with somebody and start to get a sense of maybe what's going on for you and how a situation might be impacting you. A couple words about, you know, selecting someone to get help with, because I think this is an area where people struggle. But, you know, there's many great professionals out there who can provide psychotherapy in a variety of public and private settings, right? So you have folks like me who are clinical psychologists. We provide help. Psychiatrists, although I must say accessing a psychiatrist certainly in Ottawa is extremely difficult, but nevertheless, I'll just point it out that it exists. Some family physicians provide treatment, social workers, nurse practitioners, counselors. There's a myriad of allied health professionals who are able to provide really good therapy. Fees vary extremely widely based on experience, education, etc. Just be aware, if you do have insurance, you know, in a city like Ottawa, there's a lot of folks who work for the government or for tech. They have benefits. Just be aware that many insurance companies will only reimburse for services by a licensed psychologist or someone who is supervised by a licensed psychologist. So check in with your insurance company before you go to use the benefits, just to make sure that they're going to cover it. You can typically self-refer yourself, but your insurance provider may require that you have a referral from your family physician. Again, I know this is a little bit in the weeds and a little bit administrative, but it's good to know these things, because you don't want to set up a relationship with someone, you know, be all excited to start your work and then only to discover that it's not covered. So these are things to look for before you get going. You know, it's really important that you feel a sense of trust and comfort with the individual who's providing the therapy. You know, if you look at all the data on this, there's tons of evidence to suggest that the quality of the therapeutic relationship, that is your working relationship with your clinician, will best predict the outcome of therapy. It's like anything. If I was building a deck with somebody, right, that project's going to go a lot better depending on how well we get along, how well we see eye to eye, how much we trust each other. It's like any other human endeavor, right? That just makes sense. The other thing I would say too, you know, this is really important. Effective therapy isn't about, it isn't always comfortable, right? It requires being pushed out of your comfort zone and approaching that which you've been avoiding or struggling against, or not wanting to deal with, or maybe not wanting to accept. So, you know, if you go down the road of therapy, you know, try to embrace it with an open heart and open mind, and to remember that This is about making changes for the better, and it's like a renovation. It's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better, right? If any of you have lived through a renovation, you come home, your kitchen's gone. It's like, oh my God, what have we done? But then, you know, you put it back, and it's better than ever. So the idea is that it's going to get worse before it gets better, but that's just normal. That's the way therapy works, and it's often, you know, to be honest, it's often a sign that things are going in the right direction. And again, I just want to put up this slide to really reinforce the OFIC's really wonderful initiative. They've worked very hard to go out and procure funding to allow folks to access help during this very difficult time. Here's the process here, and again, I will show the slide again. And I'm sure if you have any questions, you can reach out to OFIC. They'll be happy to direct you to the right person. Okay, so why do we get depressed and anxious? Well, it's important to realize that depression and anxiety are part of life. I mean, you know, all of our emotions play a role in helping us to navigate our lives, whether it be anger or jealousy or anxiety or panic or whatever. They all have a purpose. So there's no such thing in our world as a clinical psychologist as a negative emotion. There are just emotions. Some can be more unpleasant than others, but they all have a role to play. So for example, if you think about depression, depression forces us to stop, and deal with a negative event, usually a loss of some kind, like maybe a loved one, health, opportunity, social standing, things like that, right? I think our body has a wisdom about it, right? And it knows that given the choice, we would probably just gloss over bad things, right? I mean, who wants to sit and think about bad things? That's right, nobody, right? Including me. So I think, you know, how emotions work is that they force the issue. The symptoms of depression force the issue. For example, when we experience a sad or low mood, this clues us into that something bad has happened, right? If we lose a loved one, we feel grief. And thank God for that, right? Because it makes us attuned to each other and keeps our bonds with other people and allows us to care about people, right? Why do we feel anhedonia? That's just a fancy word for saying inability to experience pleasure. This keeps us from just distracting ourselves. It makes it so that nothing is appealing, so that we're forced to deal with the loss at hand so that we can come to grips with it and process it. Also, too, the symptoms also signal to other people that we are in need of support. So if you see somebody crying, if you see somebody who's anxious, those are mechanisms to signal to other people that we need to take steps to support that person or that we need to be taken care of, right? There's a reason why crying is visible, right? It's to signal to other people that we need some assistance. A special note about perfectionism. You know, I've been doing therapy for a long time. I have well over 10,000 hours of experience under my belt at this point. And, you know, what I've seen time and time again is that perfectionists, and I know there's none in this audience, of course, not one here either. Perfectionists are especially vulnerable to depression and anxiety, right? You know, so, you know, people who are perfectionists, they're perfectionistic, they're driven, they strive to meet standards because they should, not for approval. They experience a chronic feeling of pressure to perform. They might experience intense anxiety about failing, where failing means getting, you know, 95 out of 100 instead of 100. That's regarded as a failure. Hypercriticalness of themselves and others, a chronic sense of exhaustion, irritability, usually because not enough is getting done well enough or quickly enough. Competitiveness, most people who are classified as type A have this, what we call schema or core belief of perfectionism, working incessantly, frequently underestimating how much better their performance is relative to the norm, believing that they either have met the standard exactly or they failed, rarely taking pleasure in success, and they often lack insight. They don't view their standards as abnormal, they're just doing what is required. When you come across folks or clients who have these features about them, if you go down this list, it really, really does set people up for anxiety and depression. So if you recognize yourself in this list, you know, that's a signal to check in and say, hey, maybe the way that I'm relating to things or going about life is actually sowing the seeds for me to experience anxiety and depression, right? These are real risk factors. And again, I was saying that a little bit in jest, but you know, this is stuff that I've struggled with myself. So there's no shame in admitting that, you know, we have these things, but it's more important what we do with them, right? We don't often get to decide our personality or or how we are, but we do get to decide how we react to things. Okay, so I want to show you some cool stuff, I think anyway, about how sort of the mechanics of depression, how these things work. So there's this idea of a mood loop, and just one second. A mood loop is this resonant loop between our behavior and our mood that can sustain depression or any mood really for an ongoing basis. And the golden rule or the principle here is that if you act a certain way, you're going to get more of that mood. So when you act like a depressed or anxious person, we feel like a depressed and anxious person. This is because our body really does not like what's called dissonance, right? We don't like to think one thing and act out another, or we don't like to feel one thing or act another, right? It'd be very difficult to not be in love with somebody and carry on being in a relationship with them. It's just, it doesn't work. So the idea is that when you act one way, that will generate more of that mood. So let's go through the typical day of someone who might be experiencing depression. Let's say that you wake up in the morning and you feel apathetic, and then, well, okay, I'm going to go back to bed. Now you wake up mid-morning and you feel guilty because you went back to bed. So you know what? Who wants to feel guilty? So you soothe yourself by going down like a YouTube wormhole, right? You're just sort of distracting yourself for hours on end. Lunchtime rolls around. All you've accomplished is you've gone back to bed and watched YouTube, so you feel pretty worthless. And then, well, who wants to feel that? So I'm going to make myself temporarily feel better. I'm going to have ice cream for lunch, right? And then afternoon rolls around. You've gone back to bed, watched YouTube all day and had ice cream for lunch. Well, maybe you start to feel hopeless. So then you take a long nap and then you wake up. It's like, man, I've done nothing today. So you start to feel irritable. Maybe then you start to drink. And by the night you feel despondent, you pass out. And then you start that cycle all over again, right? So you can see how the day sort of spirals on itself, right? As the person wakes up and is in a bad mood, as they act out that mood through their behavior, it generates more consequences throughout the day that promote even more negative moods, and then so on and so forth. So it's like this feed forward mechanism that keeps people stuck. Now that's on the scale of one day, okay? So that's sort of the anatomy of depression, say on the scale of a day. Let's look at the same pattern, but over time. And I want you to think about COVID as we filter this, okay? So depressive episodes are often unwittingly engineered over time through avoidant behavior, and this, what we call TRAP model, helps to explain this. And the TRAP stands for trigger, reaction, avoidance pattern. So I think this is really fascinating. So let's say month one, you get a trigger, you get a text message from your friends, and your reaction is, well, you're overwhelmed. And so your avoidance pattern is that you don't respond. Then there's a consequence to that, right? Your friends stop texting you. So now the consequences of your initial avoidance pattern creates a new stressor. So now your friends aren't texting you anymore. Maybe you feel guilty because of this. And then your avoidance pattern is you avoid planned face-to-face social events because you haven't texted anybody, you feel bad, you've been neglecting your relationship. So, you just stop going to events because it's too embarrassing, right? What happens next? Well, maybe your friends start to give up on you completely, right? Now, so that the consequences now have created another stressor. So by month 3, now your friends are giving up on you, you feel worthless, you stop going to work, maybe you get fired from your job, and then your finances fall into poor shape, right? That by month 4 now, so you've got a new consequence, a new trigger. You got poor finances, you're feeling depressed, maybe you start to abuse alcohol, and then your partner becomes fed up and moves out, and then who knows where this goes, right? So I hope what's obvious from this is that month over month, as the person is avoiding more and more of their life, it's generating more and more consequences, which is creating more and more stressors, which is going to create a decrease in their mood, which is going to create more and more avoidance, and it just starts to roll on itself, right? So, if I have a client, it's much easier to help them at month 1 than it is to help them at month 4 because of all the range and complexity of consequences that have started to build up in their life, right? So, again, I mentioned at the outset, be proactive about seeking help because you don't want to get all the way down to month 4, 5, or 6 before you go to get help because you're going to have a lot more problems to deal with concurrently at that time. Also want to draw your attention to not only can our behavior get distorted over time, we can have what we call cognitive distortions. So it's well established that when people are depressed and anxious, their thinking becomes biased in a negative direction, right? They start to see the glass as half empty, as we say, right? There are a number of well-known cognitive distortions that are activated when someone becomes depressed and anxious. it's the, and why do we do this? Well, it's the brain's way of not being surprised, right? The depressed and anxious mind becomes reorganized to avoid further losses, sort of preemptively assuming bad things so that nothing will sneak up on us. For example, there's black and white thinking. So everything becomes pass or fail, good or bad. There's overgeneralizing. So we take a single event and inaccurately extrapolate a pattern, right? Like people never call me back, and maybe people just didn't call back once. Mind reading, right? We imagine what others are thinking without even checking in. We start fortune telling, like we predict the future in an overly negative fashion. We start catastrophizing. We're always being drawn to the worst case scenario. Or in this personalization, so we're taking blame or assigning blame unreasonably or discounting the positive, right? So good and bad things start to weigh differently. So it might take 5 compliments to weigh the same as someone who says, I didn't really like that too much, right? So like, again, the brain wants to get out in front of bad things. It's anticipating bad things. So our thinking gets distorted such that it's biased in a negative direction. There's also what we call cognitive avoidance, right? So rumination and worry can serve as a means of avoiding emotions, right? So this is where you're lying in bed 3 in the morning, cycling through things. What happens if, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing, right? And really sometimes it's just because there's no answer, or we just have to accept things, right? So many people who are vulnerable to depression and anxiety have dysfunctional beliefs about rumination and worry. They don't want to stop worrying, that worry helps me, it means I care, right? I should also say, forcing yourself to think positively and avoiding distressing thoughts, images, or memories, like using thought suppression, does not work in the long run. When we try to suppress a thought, it unleashes what we call this ironic process where we actually get more of that thought. And one of the reasons is because we're trapped in our language, right? Where to not think about something, you actually have to think about it, which means you're thinking about it. So it's impossible to suppress thoughts. We have to say, thank you, brain, I appreciate that you're anxious. Thank you for giving me the heads up. I'm going to go ahead and do X, Y, or Z now. I'm not going to get consumed with this particular worry. Another reason why we stay depressed or anxious, and this is particularly germane to COVID-19. So imagine we have all these important areas of life, and relationships, family, self-care, fun, the whole list, right? And we have them ranked out of 100 in terms of how important they are. And then we also then rank about how much of our behavior is going into fertilizing or plugging into these important areas of life. What we see is that when people are depressed or anxious, it's because there's a disconnect between the areas of their life that they say are important and their actual behavior, right? So if you're saying that your relationship is 90 out of 100 important to you, and yet you're only sort of giving 10 out of 100 effort towards that relationship, that's going to lead to low mood. Same with your self-care, same with family, same with your career. Your body's always keeping track of how you're doing, right? And if we do not have the luxury of neglecting ourselves. You can get away with that for a little bit, but if you start to neglect yourself for a long time, things start to go badly. And that's really, again, important in the context of COVID-19. We have to continue to try and be creative about finding ways to attend to our needs, because if we don't, our mood will go down. We just don't have the luxury of deferring that, unfortunately. Another thing I want to show you too, and this is sort of nested within sort of Eastern psychology ideas drawn from Buddhism, where there's a difference between pain and suffering. This is sort of a complicated graph, so I'll distill it out for you. It's actually pretty simple. The idea is that there's pain in life that's inevitable, right? So things like, getting rejected or being disappointed or falling ill or things like that, those are inevitable. It doesn't matter how well you cope with life, those things are going to happen. What we often see is that people say, nope, I reject that idea, and they start to struggle against these inevitabilities in life through avoidance, being perfect, striving, using substances like drugs, approval seeking, blaming other people, things like that. And these kind of work in the short term, but they don't work very well in the long run. And so what happens is that, you have this pain that's inevitable in life, and then we have this layer of suffering on top of it that comes from struggling against things that are going to be inevitable. So that's a really important process to be aware of. And it's important to stop and think and say, hey, what am I struggling against here that I might need to work on accepting rather than trying to fight? Likewise here, we often reach for the wrong dial, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So this is just purely a metaphor. Imagine you have two dials in the brain, one that controls the intensity of our emotions, the other that controls the willingness to have that emotion, right? A lot of us, when we're feeling unpleasant emotions, we will reach for the intensity of emotion dial and try and turn that down. The problem is we don't have direct control over that, right? So as you're sitting here watching this, imagine I said to you, hey, I want you to feel joy and euphoria like right now. Like, you won't be able to do that spontaneously. Something would have to happen in the environment, right? So same when we're feeling sad or depressed, like you just can't stop feeling those emotions because you want to. Often what we need to do is crank up the willingness to have that emotion, right? So that we can say, okay, brain, I know where you're going with this. I appreciate that you want to, that something bad has happened. You need to let me know about this, right? So trying to fight emotions will never work typically. It will accelerate them and they'll get really, say, hey, he's not listening to us, and it will accelerate its efforts to try and get our attention. So let's talk about sort of healthy coping now. So, change our, very simple principle, change our behavior, change our mood. So here's that prototypical day in the life of someone who's depressed that I talked about before. Well, instead of going back to bed, you could go to the gym, or at the moment, that would probably be more like, going for a walk or, using your home gym setup. That's going to make you feel maybe a little bit more energized, which might make you reach out to a friend, which might make you feel more valued, so on and so forth. So the idea here is that by changing your behavior, you interrupt the cycle of resonance that happens between a bad mood and bad behavior, and allows you to get access to new data that will allow you to not go down that depression staircase. Also, too, there is the possibility of challenging our thoughts and changing our mood. So we have these negative automatic thoughts that we've talked about before. So negative automatic thoughts are designed for survival. They're just a first draft, right? They send, and it's like a memo sent up to the front, to the head office for executive consideration. As such, we really want to treat our thoughts like ideas or hypotheses that need to be checked out. They're not necessarily facts. A thought is just a thought. It's not the gospel truth about anything. And so it can really be helpful to become skilled in identifying what cognitive distortions we're vulnerable to using and when they're likely to be activated. So for example, like when we're anxious, it can be helpful that can be a clue that, oh, I'm feeling anxious. This is one of those times where I'm prone to black and white thinking, or maybe I'm catastrophizing, or maybe I'm jumping to conclusions. Getting to know yourself in that way can help you to stay more arm's length from your thinking and not go down those rabbit holes. I think this is a really important point. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as you might have heard it called, is not about positive thinking or getting rid of bad thoughts, right? That doesn't work. You're not going to positive think your way out of COVID, right? This is legitimately a very difficult situation. There's a lot of uncertainty. Even with a vaccine, we have a lot of hard miles ahead of us. Being realistic is what we want to be. We don't want to be overly negative either, nor do we want to be overly positive, right? We've got to find some balance where we are striking a middle ground. Okay, so I think I've covered what I just said, or what I wanted to say, so I'll skip this slide just to prioritize some other stuff. Here's some hopefully useful information I picked up along the way that I want to share with you just about coping in general. Okay, so, and this, again, all through the lens of COVID. So you might have heard of the neurochemical dopamine, right? So the dopamine system is what we call a surprise calculator. The bigger the difference between the expected and the actual outcome, the bigger the release of dopamine, right? So if, say you're playing basketball and you stand back far away and you don't expect to make a shot, and then you throw the basketball and you get it in, you'll get a little boost because you didn't expect to get it, but you did, so a little bit of dopamine goes off. So dopamine fosters a positive mood, motivation, and interest. This is an ancient approach and explore mechanism. So for example, looking for food, you're rummaging around, you turn over a rock, and all of a sudden you find a food source, like, oh, hey, wow, I wonder if there's going to be food elsewhere, and then it activates that move forward in the world kind of mechanism, right? So how can we use this in our everyday lives? Well, to keep a sense of meaningfulness and motivation high, you need either novelty, which is new things happening, or you need nuance, which is to start to thin slice things that you already do, right? So, and so also important to understand, reaching the goal is not as important as feeling the process is going well. So think about this in COVID, right? The idea is that a lot of our usual sources of novelty or nuance have been taken away from us, right, through the different restrictions. If you want to continue to foster a sense of meaningfulness and get that sort of that dopamine going, we all have to be creative about finding new things or going deeper on things that we can access in order to, you know, keep our mood high. This might be exploring a new part of your city in the outdoors, or taking up winter sports, or learning an instrument, you know, things like this, right? We have to find novelty and nuance in our lives to keep this system going. Motivation, we often hear things like, you know, when I'm feeling more energized, I'll start exercising. It's actually the complete opposite. When you take the action, then you feel motivated. Okay, this is, again, because of that dopamine surprise calculator. You can't be surprised and subsequently motivated until something has happened. So people always talk about, I'll do that when I feel more motivated. You've got to do the action first, then the motivation will follow. The latest research on motivation suggests that, you know, forget all the self-talk, the affirmations, the resolutions. This is what works. You set an attainable goal. You make it as easy as possible to engage in the activity. Like, you get your gym bag ready. You don't try and get your stuff together the morning of. You place your stuff by the door. You put the time in your calendar. I love this saying: you trust your schedule, not your motivation, right? You just do what the calendar says. You don't wait to feel like doing it to do it. You do it no matter what you're feeling. Willpower is like a muscle. It can be developed, but it can also get fatigued. And there's this acronym: hungry, angry, lonely, tired, HALT. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you need to give yourself a break and regroup. It's okay to skip your gym routine for a day or two. Just don't turn it into a habit, right? Social media. I think this is especially, you know, I'm not sure if you've heard this term called doom scrolling, right? Of just going through, you know, if you go on Google News, it's not a happy place to be these days, right? So my take on social media is, in short, oftentimes people need to get off of it, or at least limit their exposure to what to where you're getting why you're on social media. Be honest with yourself about it. Social media is designed to hijack your dopamine system and get you addicted. That's not an accident. Phones have been also designed to be like a slot machine, right? They activate that dopamine system. We have no idea what the ultimate consequences might be, but it could be making our mental health quite worse. There's a lot of good data around this. And again, I can tell you, I see this impacting my day-to-day clinical practice for sure. Failure, becoming great at failing. That's an essential life skill. I know it sounds a bit funny to say it that way, but it's absolutely correct. You have to be willing to be bad at something to get good at it, right? Check your perfectionism. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but you run from failure at your peril, right? You have to be willing to experience it. It's going to happen anyway, right? What I always try and remember, a couple nice sayings: experience is what you get 5 minutes after you need it. Right? I love that saying, because it's exactly how life works, right? So I'll do a talk like this, and maybe I'll make a couple mistakes in here. I'm sure I have. You know what? That's not going to help me this talk, but it'll make me better for the next talk. So, your failure now is an investment in your future self. And I also love this saying too: an expert is someone who has made every mistake you can make in a field. Great. We should be embracing failure, embrace the lessons that come from trying something and not being very good at it. That's how we get better. And again, just because we're having trouble coping with COVID doesn't mean that we're failing. It just means that it's hard. It's hard to cope with it. And you need to be kind and compassionate with yourself around this. So what kind of coping should you use? Well, selecting effective coping is really about accurately detecting the amount of control available. If you've got a reasonable chance of controlling the situation, you should manage the problem directly. If you have a bill to pay, you should pay it, right? For example. If there's no reasonable chance of controlling the situation, then we want to try veering towards more managing our emotions. But here's where it gets tricky. Control is subjective. So for instance, depressed clients feel that everything's out of their control and they only manage their emotions, versus perfectionists feel like they should be able to control everything, but they can't, right? So, you've got to be very careful and stop and take a good look at, do I actually have control over this? And if you do, great, go for it. But if you don't, take a step back and take steps towards tolerating uncertainty. We also want to be careful in how we construct metrics for how you're doing, right? If you choose a metric you have control over, no control over, like people liking you, you'll be living in a chronic state of anxiety, right? So you want to always choose metrics of how you're doing that reflect things that you have control over and choices you can actually make. I'm going to skip this one just because I don't think it's super relevant, but okay, here's some other effective evidence-based forms of self-care. So exercise, we call this a keystone habit, right? Because it drags so many benefits along with it. So when you're exercising, you're likely to eat better, you're likely to sleep better, you're likely to, you're going to interact with people more because you're feeling more confident. So it's a great one. There's this what we call monitoring of heart rate variability. There's lots of apps out there. That's something you can quickly check in the morning. I won't make a big deal about it now, but you can check your heart rate variability in the morning. Again, lots of apps that do this. That will give you a measure of the relative balance between your stress system and your calming system in your body. Meditation, there's mindfulness meditation is great, although there's lots of other forms that are great. Social support, that's really helpful, especially people who are going through the same thing as you. And from a COVID perspective, we're all going through it, right? So it's tempting to want to pull back and not see people right now, but to the extent that you're able to, try to put yourself out there a little bit, even if it's just virtually by Zoom or Teams or whatever platform you're using, right? Try again to find activities that promotes a sense of mastery and or pleasure. Again, exercise is so effective in this respect. If you don't do winter sports, this is probably the winter to start. There's lots of great self-help books out here. Here are some of my all-time favorites. Reinventing Your Life, The Happiness Trap, Forgive for Good, The Subtle Art of Not Giving. I won't say that word, but all great books that will give you a good perspective on coping with stress. Again, can't plug this enough because it's so hard to access psychotherapy. These are some of the resources that are available for you to seek out. Again, contact OFIC and they will help you out. I did have a couple minutes, so there's just one slide I went past it, but I want to go back. Another problem with control is that the brain doesn't like non-events. Like we always like there to be a reason or a purpose to things, right? Things have got to make sense. If a random bad things happen, your brain won't like it, and it might blame you in order to restore a sense of control or order for what's going on. So the brain would prefer to have you be at fault for something as opposed to having random bad things happen to us, right? So the example I always use, if someone goes through a red light and someone goes through a green light and they collide, 6 months later, it's not the person who went through the red light that's struggling, it's the person who went through the green light, because guess what? They weren't doing anything wrong. Boom, they get hit by that person. Like, what would they do differently? So they might say, oh, if I had been more vigilant, if I had left 5 minutes later, et cetera, et cetera. So when there's not a good reason for bad things happening, we often tend to blame ourselves because it gives a sense of control. And I would also just say, like, our life is under no obligation to make sense to us. Sometimes bad things just happen, and that's just the way it is. And COVID is a lot about this. The true meaningfulness or impact of an event may not be obvious for days, months, or years. Perspective takes time and makes a big difference. Like, for instance, when people break up in a relationship, they feel like it's the end of the world, but you know what? It could be the beginning of the very next relationship that they're supposed to be in taking place, and this just has to happen. Okay, well, listen, thank you very much. I believe there's a question and answer session. I would be absolutely delighted to take your questions. I know that was a lot of information, so if there's anything you'd like me to unpack for you, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kelly. That was very informative and an excellent presentation. I know I picked up tidbits, especially about the dopamine. It sounds like dope, dopamine, yep. But it's actually dopamine. And I remember when I played sports and when I did a great play or when I did something, you get that adrenaline feeling, you've done something. And it actually is the same thing when you're at work. When you do something or you do a presentation or you get that little pat from the back from your boss or somehow you recognize it, you get that same feeling. So it's a little bit of exuberance. So I think it's very, very, very great. And you talked about the type A, people who work to live, but it should be live to work. It shouldn't be work to live. And that's the balance. Some of us type A people who are so much driven, trying to succeed, trying to do all that and trying to make all this money in the world and have a perfect life and perfect family and perfect relationships. It's just, it's somewhere in here is going to give, right? So I think it's a shout out to those people, the type A type people. Hey, look, don't work to live, but live to work, and manage your stresses and manage your relationship and manage your anxieties and so on. So I remember when I was coaching, I saw some kids who were really, really trying hard. but that's not when they perform the best. They perform the best when they were relaxed and worked hard. So that's the message I think you were giving, and I think some of the tidbits you've given, it was great. And I again shout out to all the people who are listening and so on. Look, if you need a session, we'd be more than happy to organize for your session for you, or to put you in touch with actually with the service provider. We will not be keeping or retaining any information about you. The only thing we'll do is we'll provide you the name of the service provider. We can give you actually a list of names and you can choose one, and then they will be just billing us. That's it. And there is really no real limit as to the number of sessions you can have. That will be determined by the service provider, not by us. And the length of the sessions is also determined by the service providers. All we can do is we've been providing funding where people do see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that we are at the stage now, I think, at the latter part of it. And come next June or so, I think you'll see more things more to normal, but it'll never be the same again. Some of our behavior will change because technology has brought us a lot of stuff, and that has facilitated our lives. And there's new modes of doing things. But I know technology has also added anxiety to a lot of people, especially to the older people who are not familiar with it. The only thing I can suggest that is reach out and get help. There are organizations willing to help you with the technology, and also to deal with any of the stresses and all the things that we're going through because of this COVID-19. Also, this is a Christmas time. This is season of holidays. We get more anxieties during that time usually, and this time is going to be even harder because we cannot be with some of the families because we cannot travel, or they cannot travel, or they have a situation, or if you have a parent or a grandparent in a senior citizen home or long-term care, it might be more challenging for you to go see or even give them a hug because it may not be available. So these are some of the challenges I'm sure we are facing, and I'm sure we'll find a way to deal with them. And if we can help in any way, remember what I said, the OFIC's mission every morning, every time we get up, our job is, how can we help somebody? How can we make somebody's life better? It's a simple mission. That's what the mission is supposed to be. When you get up, what do you want to do for the day? So I think there's a number of organizations out there who are willing and want to do that. Nashi, I'll turn it over to you. I know Nashi will be asking and referring the questions he has received from the participants to Dr. Kelly, and Dr. Kelly will answer them, and we'll jump in where we can. Go ahead, Nashi.
Oh, hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So I have a few questions here. One of them is, what advice do you have for elderly parents who have lost children to COVID? This is in context of elderly parents losing their children to COVID, and how to best deal with their grief and the new isolation that comes in. And additionally, an advice for those that are taking care of such people.
Oh, let me just say, first of all, that's a really tough situation, and certainly my heart goes out to anyone who is in that position. Grief is often something that simply takes time, and time and a lot of support. Grief is a natural reaction, and there's no right way to grieve, and sometimes it will, and it also doesn't follow a time course, right? It might take 6 months, it might take a year, who knows, right? The important thing is to try and seek out people who are going through the same thing as you as much as possible, and to continue to process it, right? It needs to be made sense of. Now, I appreciate this is very difficult during COVID. It's just one of the many ways it compounds, where at the very time where we need the most social support, it's very difficult to access each other. But as much as can be, as much as it can be managed through electronic communications, but again, I'm hearing this is for someone who's elderly, might be difficult for them to manage. So it's time, it's support, it's processing, and making use of the tools that we do have available at this particular moment. But in all that said, sometimes things are just very difficult because they are. right? And the fact that someone might be struggling in a situation like that doesn't mean that they're failing at coping with it. It just means that it's very difficult. And again, my heart goes out very deeply to anyone who's in that particular situation.
Yeah, I think this would be applicable to not just any older people or anybody who has lost. I mean,
Anyone.
you know, and it's just a very trying situation. And on top of that, you can't even go visit, and really, so that makes it harder. So your point is very well taken.
Okay, another question we have is this person thanks you for the talk, and it's very informative. Could you comment please on the value of humor and laughter as a cope-up strategy?
Yeah, 100%. So and I'll go into the brain for just a second. So in the brain, you know, there's many neurochemicals, but there's two competing ones. So there's norepinephrine and then there's dopamine. And as our stress level goes up, norepinephrine rises and rises and rises. And then what happens, and then dopamine goes down. And then that's when we become tired and exhausted. If you've ever had the experience of someone making a joke at just the right time, you know, maybe in a tense meeting, or, you know, when everyone's tired and you're traveling or whatever, that shoots up, that allows for a little bit of a release of dopamine, and then norepinephrine comes down, the dopamine comes up, and you can continue on. So humor is a really valuable coping strategy. It can buy us fuel to kind of like keep going and persevere in a difficult setting. I would just say very quickly though that, you know, we need to strike a balance between humor, but then also connecting with tough emotions that we're feeling. So in my line of work, we have what's called smiling depression, right? Where someone's really depressed, but they're kind of laughing all the time and making jokes because they're kind of avoiding difficult feelings. So I think I would say as long as there's a balance between connecting with the difficult emotions that you need to, but then also leveraging humor as appropriate for a way of relief and just sort of normality, that I think that's fantastic. And we know that there's a good neurobiological basis for this.
I would go even further, and I would add to that, like if you have some hobbies that you really enjoy, for example,
Right.
playing music or playing sports, I mean, they even add to the laughter. Okay, so anything that you find that works with you, any kind of hobbies, uh, having jokes and having fun with your colleagues, with your relatives, with your friends. I mean, that's a great way to beat stress and anxiety.
So another question here is, how is going to a counselor or a therapist different from a visit to psychologist?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, in some ways, it would all look very similar, right? So a counselor or a psychologist or a social worker or an OT who does psychotherapy, we're all going to do very similar things, right? We're going to, when you first come in, we would do an assessment. We would go through things like informed consent. We would take a history of your medical history, family history, all that kind of stuff. And then we would develop a treatment plan, and then we would you know, use techniques that through our training to help you out. And you know, so it could look very similar in some instances. Psychologists are often trained to a very high degree for dealing with very severe problems, and often, you know, we often work in hospitals, but not always. I work in private practice, but I have worked in hospital settings before as well. So you know, we have the training and expertise to deal with very severe presentations. Sometimes you'll see a counselor where it's more like supportive psychotherapy, where it's a lot of listening and validating that, and that can be very important. But sometimes there's serious problems that need to be addressed, and there you want to, you know, a more action-oriented therapy. So it's not so much who you're seeing as opposed to what their training is and what they're going to do. So it can look both similar and different depending on what you want to do. But I would say this, you know, there are many allied health professionals that do amazing cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not just psychology that does great work in that domain. So if you can access someone who's not a psychologist, you can also get very good service through those treatment paths as well.
I would add one more thing. What would be the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? I know psychiatrists can also issue or give a prescription, but I don't know if a psychologist. Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Sure. So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who's done a specialty, usually 6 years training in psychiatric medicine. They, as you point out, they prescribe medications. In Ontario, psychologists are not able to prescribe medications. Some psychiatrists will do therapy, but not all. The way it typically works is a lot of psychiatrists now will do what's called med consults. So your family doctor or your psychologist, excuse me, will refer you to a psychiatrist to have your medications checked out or maybe start a medication. They don't often follow clients long term. They're sort of more expert consultants, but some of them will follow patients and will do therapy. Of course, it's paid for by OHIP in that case, and because it's paid for by OHIP, the wait lists are extremely long. And I would also add to there's some family doctors that do therapy as well, but again, because it's paid for by OHIP, the wait lists are extremely long.
Okay, so especially in our case, if people are waiting to see a psychiatrist and they like to access a psychologist, or counselor, this is service that we're able to provide, so you don't have to wait in the long. So we can give you the service on a timely basis, which is always very important.
Absolutely.
That's right. Just to elaborate on that, there are limited number of sessions that are available, and the last date for us to have those exhausted is by Feb 19th. So if we have a lot of clients even before that, that might be exhausted even prior to Feb 19th. So just keep that in mind. And if you see anyone here see a need for trying a therapy session for your stress, and especially if you have never tried it before and are curious to see what it is, what it feels like to go and have that, this is a good opportunity for you. So I have another question here.
Can I just add one more word to that? Now, yeah. You don't have to have attended this webinar in order to access the free consultation. You can tell your friend, if you're aware of somebody who may need help, they don't have to, there's no prerequisite for accessing the free consultation. Just wanted to add that.
Right. Just send an email to PM COVID-19. You would have seen those on the flyers we sent out. So just send a quick note there, and our intake process will basically get you in touch with one of the therapists that's available, and from that point on, we don't deal with the session itself, and it's between you and the therapist, and their procedures will take over. The question here is, how do we communicate to children on the importance of therapy? So in some cases, there is anxiety among children as well. They're not seeing their friends as they used to. Now, many of the kids are at home, and they're not visiting their grandparents. So many things are going on, or it could be a behavioral issue of the children. So I want this as broad as possible. How do we communicate to kids for seeking any kind of therapy, that for that matter, for any reason?
Right. So I think one of the most important jobs of a parent is to establish currency with their child in their relationship, right? So it's all about the relationship. We know that punishments and rewards have sort of limited applicability. So it's about, it's talking with your child and helping them to understand what's going on for them. Because children often don't have the language to explain what's going on for them. They may need the adult to help to sort of prompt them a little bit. Kids will often too manifest physical symptoms, right? I should also add, I'm not a child psychologist. It's not my wheelhouse, but I can give you some general information. So when kids talk about their stomach hurting, or that they're having trouble sleeping, or having nightmares, or things like that, that might be a sign to check in with them to get hey, what's going on for you? And the general rule of thumb with kids is you talk to them as much about things as they can understand. So whether it's a divorce or COVID or whatever, like, you don't not talk about those things. You talk about them at a level at which they can understand, and you try to get a sense of what's going on for them. And in terms of suggesting therapy to children, say, hey, just like mommy and daddy go to the Dr. So-and-so to have look at our throat or look at our our ears or whatever, like sometimes we need to go to people to talk about our emotions and what's coming up for us. So just normalizing it, validating. I would also say too that for Usually for children, it's just as important that the parents be getting assistance as is the children, because the children are so dependent on the parents, and often there can be challenges embedded within the parenting style that can have ramifications for the children. So, especially if the child's really young, a lot of times it's about talking to the parent and teaching the parent how to help the child, as opposed to the child being in therapy themselves. But that's for younger children. So, does that answer the question? Is there anything else I can speak to around that?
No, that's that. I think that gives a complete picture, and I have more questions coming up. I think this one, I will generalize the question here. Basically, it's a lengthy question. It's about the manifestation of stress to stress in physical form. Like, for instance, a person gets up a few times to go to washroom in the middle of the night, but then he's unable to go back to sleep after that, and wants to know if this is he just cannot sleep. So is this related to stress or anxiety? So again, I think there might be other people having similar questions here. So I think it's the relationship between stressors and physical well-being.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So there's a very clear relationship between the mind and the body, right? We treat them as artificially. We talk about them as different, but they're all one and the same, right? And the brain is listening in on all aspects of our body at all time. And one of the ways that stress does manifest is through physical symptoms. And for some people who have difficulty experiencing emotions, their body will be sort of more prone to those physical symptoms. So we call these like somaticizers, right? So people, instead of feeling anxious, they might get a migraine, or instead of feeling stressed, some people may get a rash of some kind. Troubles with sleep is stress almost always shows up in difficulties with sleep. And there it's important to get at root causes. So what you'll see is people getting into all kinds of routines, like doing relaxation before bed and meditation and this and that and the other thing, and like it really doesn't do anything. What one needs to do is to reckon with what's going on in one's day-to-day life, whether it's working too much or if there's financial pressures or whatever. You have to get to the root causes. That maintenance insomnia that the question asker is describing is when you typically the pattern there is you have no trouble falling asleep, dead to the world within minutes, and then 3, 4 in the morning wakes up, and then can't get back to sleep, and we call this wired and tired, right? The person's exhausted, but they're wired at the same time. That's caused by cortisol. Cortisol is lowest in the evening and then rises in the morning. And what you see when people are woken up in that maintenance insomnia is that their cortisol is going up too early and waking their body up out of sleep. So people go to sleep, melatonin goes up, cortisol goes down, and then over the night these switch. And so that cortisol is coming online too early. It's very difficult to address that pharmacologically. Sleep medications don't work around that problem. The person has to get down to root causes in terms of what's going on in their life. Sometimes it's a sign of depression as well. We know depression, the cortisol system is firing like a lot stronger than it would be under normal circumstances. So it's just, again, I guess I keep going back to the theme of get to the root causes of what's going on. Don't ignore the sleep problem. It's because there's something going on in your life that is waking you up out of sleep. Now, of course, as we get older, sleep gets shallower and not as long, right? So it's not uncommon as you get older for your sleep to be a little thinner and to also be not quite as deep. This is an important tip. Sometimes people will try and go to bed really early, say like 8 o'clock or something, to catch up on their sleep. It doesn't work. The metaphor we use is, imagine you have 6 inches of pizza dough, but you have a 9-inch pan and you're trying to spread out the dough. It's going to be thin and have holes in it. What you want to do is go to bed later, and it's better to have 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep than to be in bed for 8 hours and be waking up and going back to sleep and this, that, and the other thing. The other thing too is if you wake up, don't stay in bed for more than about 10 minutes max, 10, 15 minutes. If you can't get back to sleep, get up, have a really super boring book that you have on standby, and go read that boring book. I've written a couple books, they might help you. They're quite boring. Keep those on the side, read them, and then what will happen is your eyes start to kind of like defocus. Then you try and go asleep again. But do not lie there staring at the ceiling. That's like the worst thing you can do. Sorry, that was a long answer, but sleep is really important.
Right. So I have more questions coming up. So this is actually there might be a bit of a humor in this, but it's not. It's a pretty serious question. How do we reach out to people that deny COVID-19, and also especially if it is affecting them or could affect them, and their total denial of it? How do we reach out to them?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. I mean, I think empathy is always the way to go with any human being, right? You try to understand their experience, and oftentimes denial comes from a place of anxiety. So, you would want to sort of validate and normalize that, hey, yeah, it's normal to be scared of this. It's normal to sort of, want to stick our head in the sand and pretend that it's not existing. So, normalizing, validating, the way to not go about it is like, hey, you idiot, like, when are you going to get the program? COVID's this big problem. Like, people just shut down, right? They're not going to be listening anymore. So when you're dealing with anybody, it's about sort of, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? And we want to think about ways to be effective, and then we could be right after the fact, right? So there's that. And I think I had a second thought for that, but it's escaped me at the moment. But just normalizing and validating is the way to go when people are resistant to ideas. You got to take the side door. You can't bust through the front door. It never works.
I'd just like to add one more thing, or maybe you can comment on that, Dr. Kelly. There's the Western philosophies, and there's also the Eastern philosophies that refer to the yoga and other ways of, meditation, other ways of managing stress, other ways of managing anxiety, or even if there's a lack of sleep, there's a different asanas you can do in the yoga to help you with that. So maybe I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How do you combine the two? I mean, you don't have to only go this way or the highway. I'm sure there's a good mix you can use.
Absolutely. Like I think the best, well, first of all, I will say the best coping is the one that you'll use, right? So it's senseless to have a whole bunch of coping that you don't do, right? So the best exercise routine that you'll use, that you can do, is the one you'll actually do, right? So I would say that. And I think, what makes people an effective coper is knowing what works for them and knowing where to pull from, right? They can pull from all the different areas, even if it's eclectic, it doesn't matter, right? And put it all together in a program that works for you. And I think the biggest thing is that it's sustainable over time. I think the biggest mistake I see with people coping is that they shoot way too high. That works for a week or two, it collapses under its own weight, and then they're back to doing nothing, and then they get frustrated. They just kind of cycle up and down. It's like, pick a few things, try and do a little bit every day. It's like incrementalism, right? A little bit every day over time is extremely powerful, rather than trying to hit the home run and then just, going up and down, up and down.
So there is another question here. Just want to give you a little bit of a precursor to this. This is about someone that's been struggling with mental illness even before COVID-19. And any thoughts on how to cope up with this pre-existing condition? And in this context, I would like to add one thing here. The program that we're talking about, the therapy sessions, is very specific to COVID-19. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to be addressing any pre-existing issues, like, if there are marital issues or health issues related to it. However, any other pre-existing issues that are considerably, increased because of COVID-19 would still qualify. So, but you can't just, it can't be solely pre-existing conditions. Just to clarify that, coming back to this question here, is this person has struggled with mental illness prior to COVID-19, and any thoughts on how to cope up with my pre-existing conditions, and that's considerably must have increased.
Yeah. Yes. So it's a great question, and it's important to point out that yes, people who came into COVID already struggling with mental health challenges have an extra layer of challenge that they have to navigate. But interestingly, I would also say, well, I'll say one more thing before I move on. The general advice that I give to people is, just try to hold the line. Like, it's a difficult time as is. Don't worry about sort of making, taking giant steps in your therapy or whatever, or taking on new exposure activities or whatever. It's like, if you can hold the line and sort of tread water, that's great. That's wonderful. That may not always be possible, of course, because again, like, it's adding extra layers of stress. what I have seen with a lot of clients is that some of my clients I think are just perfectly prepared for COVID, and they're almost sort of like seeing like, okay, now everybody knows what I've been going through now that everybody is experiencing the stress of COVID. So some people are coming in with actually an enhanced resilience, but again, just to normalize and validate, yes, if you came into COVID with a pre-existing condition, there's an extra layer of challenge there. Try to tread water, try to just hold the line, be kind to yourself. It is just as difficult as you're imagining that it is.
So
I just like to add to, if you have a pre-existing condition prior to COVID, and if the COVID has further exacerbated the situation or has added to and more of an impact, we will still cover you as long as the health professional decides it's okay, because it's really up to health professional to let us know whether this is further added on by COVID. So anybody who's interested in accessing the services, apply for it, and we'll let the health professional decide. We won't decide because we're not expert at that at OFIC.
So I do have, unfortunately, we're out of time for this webinar, but I do have several other questions that are coming up at this time. And I want to tell people, if you still have issues that you would want to deal with, just send an email to pmcovid19@ofic.ca. And if you're interested in the therapy, but before we close up, I guess I'll try to squeeze in one or two questions, if you may.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We can extend it a bit, Nashi. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
If Dr.
Okay.
Kelly did that, we'll extend it for a couple of more questions.
Excellent. Okay, I appreciate that very much. So the question here is, it's a very good question. It's are there any self-help books that you suggest for people to read? In general, like any books?
So I think my very favorite is called The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. I think it's got a really nice way of looking at life and looking at some of the realities that we contend with. There's another one called actually I have it right here. I'm just going to read the exact title. It's called the Antidote: Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. It's a great book. Another by Oliver Berkman. There's another book called Reinventing Your Life by Jeffrey Young. That's one that I recommend quite a bit. And then there's another one too called Forgive for Good by Dr. Fred Luskin, and he is it's about forgiveness and acceptance. So those are the ones that I find recommending quite a bit. And if I could also put a plug in for the podcast that I do, Thoughts on Record, you can find it on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, all that kind of stuff. It's free. We don't make any money off of it. I just like to put really good information out there. So it's for both mental health clinicians and consumers. So that's a resource you can access as well. And I do the podcast. So if you like what you've heard today, you'll hear more of it on the podcast.
Sure. You could share that link with me, and we'll send that as part of the email.
Sure. And also, if you're not able to answer or post the questions that people have, you can send it to us and we can forward it to Dr. Kelly, and he can reply to it at a later stage as well.
Let's see. I think here's one more. It says, what's your response to people who relax and meditate and visualize before bedtime?
Yeah, so I think, again, relaxation is always a double-edged sword, right? Because how can I explain this quickly? So the idea is when we say someone's having a panic attack, I'll just bear with me for a second as I explain this. When someone's having a panic attack, what we want, they're catastrophizing about the symptoms, like, oh my God, I'm dying, I'm having a heart attack, I'm having a stroke or whatever, right? And then they do all these anxious behaviors that serve to only sort of prove the veracity of those catastrophic misinterpretations. So we don't typically want people doing anything that would reinforce those catastrophic thoughts. So one of the problems with relaxation is when we try to get people, when people go to do deep breathing and relaxation in response to stress, it kind of it kind of reinforces the idea that the stress is bad and that it's like we can't deal with this and this and that and the other thing. So the challenge with sleep and relaxation is that when you try too hard to go to sleep, of course, it doesn't work. You can imagine lying there, you're like, okay, I need to sleep now. Okay, am I relaxed yet? Like it doesn't work, right? So you almost want to go the other way in some ways. You have to say, okay, well, if I can't sleep the whole night and I'm awake the whole night, then it will kind of be a tough tomorrow, but it will be okay. So it's always a degree of caution about using relaxation before bed, because if it starts to become kind of a compulsion and starts to create pressure to sleep, then it will backfire, right? But if someone can have a healthy relationship with it, and it becomes not sort of like used like a drug almost, then I think it's okay. So there's a lot of nuance around this, and so again, like it's not relaxation is not a terrible thing. Like I do it in the morning for that reason. Like I do my deep breathing in the morning, almost taking it like a vitamin, let's say. But I don't like to do it before bed because I think it creates a pressure to sleep that can backfire and cause a paradoxical outcome. Hope that's clear. It's a little bit nuanced, but I hope that makes sense.
Well, I think with that, we will take that as the last question. And thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. I know we're well past the 2:30 that we had originally planned for, but this was a very informative and very useful webinar. And I thank you very much, Dr. Kelly, for providing very good tidbits that I'm sure we can all use and take with us and help us manage stress and anxiety. Nasty, thank you very much for helping out on this thing. Anytime we put on these webinars, there's a lot of volunteers who work on this. I mean, we are the ones we are in the front and we're the face of it, but there's a lot of people behind who make this thing happen. So I just want to mention a few of these. Puneet Agarwal, who's our technician, the technical advisor as well as director. Thank you, Puneet. Also, Dr. Narinder Gargi, he's been sending all those emails and managing all the other stuff. And Avid Solutions, specifically Prasanta, our treasurer, Kulbhushan Kapoor, our secretary, Nagmani Sharmaji, Payush Goyal, who is our publicist, and everybody who out there helped in any way. I wanted to thank you. And even if we help one person avoid any kind of serious illness or serious drastic actions that they would have taken, to me, that is well worth it. And that's what this is all about. That's what we live for. We all have our regular jobs, and then we do this on the side as volunteers. But the society has given a lot to us. Canada has given a lot to us. So it's our way of paying back, and our way of paying back to the community and to the society at large. And that's what we want to do. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone again, and thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, please send it to us. And if you want to take the sessions, the address is right there, is pmcovid19@ofic.ca if you want to access free sessions. And just remember that it's a free one-on-one consultation therapy. And all you need to do is send us an email, and we do not retain any information on you. OFIC will not retain any information on you. We will simply refer you to the professional therapist, and they will be dealing with you directly, and then they will send us the bill we will pay for. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and thank you. And that's the end. Thank you, everyone.